What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday. You know what time it is. Time to get into those hot waiver ads as we head into week 6. You don't need me to tell you, but the fantasy season is flying by. 5 weeks now already in the rearview mirror, and you would think that there really wouldn't be a high population of players available on the waiver wire, but I think even this week there are a few gems. If I did have to pick a position that I think is the strongest this week, I think it is the running back position. There is a mix of names that have flown under the radar, with a couple of new names as well. On top of that, the tight end position, while we only do have 3 players listed on there, all 3 of them have never been listed in our waiver wire section so far this season. And then looking at the wide receiver position, while many of the names have been players that have been on the waiver wire, picked up, and then dropped again, but with the wide receiver position as a whole being a strong point for many teams, I believe if we were all given a choice, whether we got a strong running back group or strong wide receiving core in this week's waiver wire, I think the majority of us would choose those positions of need, being tight end and running back. So I think we're in for a treat this week. We'll get into exactly all of those players in much more detail, but before we do, I quickly wanted to shout out that if you do enjoy these videos, whether that's our waiver content, our start sits, or even our trade content, if you do enjoy those, if they've helped you so far this season along the way, all we would possibly ask in return to show your support is simply hit that like button. It helps us in growing the channel, pushes these videos out to a new audience who may not have seen our channel yet. So if you do enjoy these videos, definitely hit the like button, and if you are one of those newer viewers, be sure to subscribe. We're posting videos nearly every day of the week, but with that, we'll hop right into the waivers. Before we do though, stat of the day. And yesterday's stat of the day was in weeks 1 through 4, which running back spent the least amount of time behind the line of scrimmage. The correct answer was Darrell Williams, and I didn't see anybody got that question correct on either Twitter or in the YouTube comment section. Fear not though, we have Redemption, a very similar stat of the day question, except instead of the least time behind the line of scrimmage, today's stat of the day is which running back currently has spent the most time behind the line of scrimmage. And although the majority of the games have finished in week 5, we are going to use the weeks 1 through 4 for this one. So once again, that's which running back in weeks 1 through 4 has currently spent the most time behind the line of scrimmage. If you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way though, let's hop right into the video, and we'll begin as per usual with the running back position. As mentioned in the intro, this is going to be the deepest position in my opinion this week, and up at the top we do have a very high-end option this week. If you did miss out on getting Damian Williams last week, Chuba Hubbard the week before that, if you're thin at running back, we definitely suggest targeting this player with as much fab as possible. That's Devontae Booker of the New York Giants. Unless you've been under a rock, you're all well aware that Saquon Barkley did suffer an injury. He had his leg rolled up on, mostly his ankle. Watching the replay though, it was a very nasty injury. I'm obviously not a doctor, but anybody watching that can agree that it definitely looked like it had the potential to be a season ender for him. Some positive news though for Saquon Barkley owners as well as New York Giants fan is that he did avoid any serious injury. That's not to say of course he won't miss any games, but his x-rays did come back negative, so expecting Saquon Barkley back at some point during the season, that's a reasonable expectation, at least from the information that we have right now. Regardless, Saquon Barkley was already a player that was dealing with injuries at the early part of the season. Now, 5 weeks in, he's dealing with an even more significant injury, so I wouldn't be surprised if Saquon Barkley is out for several weeks. We're talking 3-5 plus. In his place, Devontae Booker looks to be the lead back in this offense. In week 5 against Dallas, in his absence, Devontae Booker received 16 touches on the ground. While he wasn't all that efficient, rushing for 2.63 yards per carry, he did still receive the lion's share of the touches out of the backfield. And not only was he involved in rush attempts on the ground, but it was very promising to see that he received 4 targets, catching 3 of them. Once again, not very efficient, but in fantasy football, we all know volume is king, and Devontae Booker ended up scoring 20 fantasy points on the back of a rushing touchdown and receiving touchdown. So if that's any indication of what his usage is going to be like moving forward, Devontae Booker may very well be a player that you can log in as a potential RB2 in every week that Saquon Barkley's out. Keep in mind though that his next 2 matchups are rather difficult against the LA Rams and the Carolina Panthers. Also, Daniel Jones is injured, Kenny Galladay's injured, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, the list goes on and on. The New York Giants offense, it is completely dismantled, so expecting Devontae Booker to have scoring opportunities frequently in every matchup, especially against 2 of these tough defenses. For that, I'm not expecting him to post RB1 numbers like he did this week, but still being able to grab him off the waivers, start him in your RB2 slot with some guaranteed volume, that's going to have significant value for a player that you're getting off waivers. So clearly, he leads this list this week at the running back position, but we do have other great options as well, like Darrell Williams. I have him listed as the second best option at the running back back position, and unfortunately Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a player who was bouncing back from a poor start to this season, he unfortunately did suffer an injury this week against the Buffalo Bills. The severity of his injury at this point, it is unknown, but considering the fact that he was ruled out of the game, that does open up the door for him potentially missing games in the future. You hate to see it, especially for a player who couldn't eclipse 46 rushing yards in his first two contests, but followed that up against some quite tough defenses, the LA Chargers and Philadelphia Eagles, even rushing for over 100 yards in each of these contests, catching a receiving touchdown in both of those contests leading up to this Bills matchup as well. So right when fantasy owners could trust him, he does suffer this injury, but Darrell Williams does look to be the running back taking over in his place. In CEH's absence, he received 5 carries on the ground, was very efficient with his touches, rushing for over 5 yards per carry, saw 5 targets, catching 3 of them for 18 yards, so rather efficient in the receiving game as well. And if he's able to bring a similar skill set to that of CEH, and CEH misses either one or multiple matchups moving forward, Darrell Williams, much like Devontae Booker, could have some RB2 value. The reason though he won't rank higher than Devontae Booker is because we do know the injury with Saquon Barkley is going to be a bit more serious, at least from what we know right now, likely holding him out for a longer period of time, so investing in Devontae Booker, even with it being a much less potent offense, you're going to get a player that's going to have much more utility for a longer span of time. Either way, if you're thin at running back whatsoever, I would suggest putting in a claim or investing some of your fab into these players. Invest as much as you need if you're very thin and desperate at the running back position, because these two people could be an anchor for your team while you figure out a long-term solution. Coming in third though, we have Alex Collins. He's a player that likely should have been higher in last week's waiver wire list. I'll take the responsibility for that. I was not expecting Chris Carson to be ruled out of last week's contest. Yes, I did know he was banged up and that they were splitting touches, but had I assumed or had I known that Alex Collins was going to be the starter, the lone starter in that offense, even if it was just for 1 week, he would have shot directly up the waiver wire rankings for me. This week, I won't make that mistake. He ranks third, but unfortunately for a lot of people out there, he is going to be owned. As soon as the news that Chris Carson was going to be unavailable, many people did pick him up off the free agent market. If he is available for your team though, make sure to grab him. At this point, Chris Carson's week 6 availability is up in the air. I do have to admit though that similarly to last week, the matchup against the LA Rams, it's not very fruitful for Alex Collins, so his upside, it could be called into question once again in this week's matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, not the greatest. So even if Alex Collins does get a full workload, he's not exactly going to be an upside play this week, but anytime a running back is getting volume, they're going to have a good chance to score, and with Russell Wilson having an injured finger, his availability up in the air as well, the team may need to rely even more on the run game, so Alex Collins could be a really solid start this week as well. Alright guys, we're moving into the next player, and I would say this is going to be a bit of a tier break, and this is also going to be a player that is largely owned in many leagues. His ownership is a bit over 60%, but with that ownership, that means nearly 40% of you guys out there do have the ability to get him. This is Michael Carter of the New York Jets. I personally have not gone out of my way to consider him a trade option or a high priority off the waivers or free agent market yet so far at the running back position, because his upside has been called into question so far this season just due to the offense that he's on. If you're in a full PPR league though, he has been seeing decent involvement in the receiving game so far this season, and that reached a pinnacle in this week 5 matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, a game in which he saw his most receptions, coming in with 3 receptions. Not only that though, he posted his second highest game when it comes to receiving yardage, but what's most impressive for me was he now found the end zone for the second straight week. For me, that's a really important factor, because part of the reason that I have been overlooking Michael Carter has been just due to the offense as mentioned, and the concerns of him being in a poor offense means limited scoring capabilities, but with him scoring in back-to-back weeks now on the ground, him having heavy involvement in the receiving game, meaning he's not going to be game scripted out, I do think that he is now growing into a better fantasy option, a more consistent one, and quite frankly at this point I feel confident that what we've seen from him is not going to be the best so far this season. I think there is still some room for improvement from him. I think from both a volume perspective as well as an efficiency perspective, and if there's any improvements to this offense as a whole, Michael Carter is going to be one of the main beneficiaries. He's not a new name, he's not a new player. Some of you may have had him on your bench so far for most of the season, but if you just so happen to be in that nearly 40% of teams that do have him available on the waiver wire, maybe you're an owner of CEH or Saquon Barkley, and this week you're getting a bit desperate, throw Michael Carter's name into the hat. He may not have a ton of upside, but he's getting somewhat consistent volume, and his work in the receiving game gives him a relatively high floor in PPR leagues. Moving into the next running back, this is actually going to be the second to last running back, and one that I'm personally pretty excited about. This is going to be Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. targets, and the reason I'm so excited for him is because I quite possibly foolishly added him to my running backs you should have drafted list, and since doing that, he received a whopping 1 rush attempt in week 1 against Miami and has not seen a rush attempt since. Well, in week 5 against Houston, he saw 11 rush attempts, and while I'm not here to take victory laps, those 11 rush attempts only went for a mere 23 rushing yards. It was still positive to see any type of involvement from him in the offense nonetheless, and with Damien Harris suffering an injury, the reason that Rhamondre Stevenson was able to get some touches in this game, it's possible that Damien Harris, a player who's been a bit injury prone so far since entering the league, he could miss some time, and if he does, Stevenson, he could be potentially the lead back. The New England Patriots, they do some pretty wacky things when it comes to the running back position, so I can't say for certain that the amount of touches he received in this game is going to translate to what their game plan is going to be in next week's contest, even if Harris isn't available. But one thing that I do know for sure is that Rhamondre Stevenson, from what we saw from him in preseason, he was phenomenal. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that he would compete for possibly the best running back in all of the preseason. I know it's just preseason, but 30 rush attempts, 216 rushing yards, a rate of 7.2 yards per carry. That's Alvin Kamara-esque. His production doesn't end there though. He had 5 rushing touchdowns, so if he's able to translate any of that type of upside over to the regular season, Rhamondre Stevenson could be producing even much better than Damien Harris, and if you're able to get that off the waiver wire, even at quite possibly a discount when compared to some of the other running backs I've already talked about, I think there's a chance that you're potentially getting the best value out of all of them. Just remember, it is going to be a much more risky investment. First of all, we don't know how long Damien Harris could potentially miss time for. Second, it's the Patriots. We don't know if Rhamondre Stevenson will even see the field next week, even if Damien Harris is out. And then third, the production that we saw from him when given 11 touches in this past game was not as promising as the production we saw from him out of preseason. So which version of Stevenson are we going to get? Those 3 risk factors have combined to drop him down the waiver list, but either way, this is another interesting name at the running back position that desperate owners out there can place bids on to potentially be a game changer for your team. Moving into the final running back that we do have on the waiver list this week, it's going to be Khalil Hebert of the Chicago Bears. As we all know, last week David Montgomery did go down with an injury likely to hold him out for several weeks. Damian Williams, of course, being the top target to get off the waiver wire last week due to David Montgomery going down with an injury. He didn't disappoint anybody that got him off the waiver wire. This week against the Las Vegas Raiders, he saw 16 rush attempts on the ground for 64 yards, rushing at an efficient 4 yards per carry, even seeing solid David Montgomery work in the passing game, receiving 3 targets, even posting a rushing touchdown as well. He was really the whole package, so anybody that did get him off the waivers, they were rewarded. And while I do fully expect Damian Williams' workload is going to remain similar to this in every game that David Montgomery is unavailable to suit up, one player though that is going a bit under the radar, I believe, is going to be Khalil Hebert. Quietly, Herbert actually led this team in rushing, even having more rush attempts on the ground, coming in with 18, rushing for 75 yards total, even posting better efficiency numbers on the ground. His 18 rush attempts went for 75 rushing yards, a rate of 4.17 yards per carry, so while very similar, he did edge out Damian Williams in this area. And while as mentioned, Damian Williams is likely to lead in many of those key areas like receiving out of the backfield as well as red zone touches. Any player that's receiving 18 touches on the ground does deserve to be owned, picked up off the waiver wire, and potentially even started. And while a 1-game sample, it is a bit too small to overly invest in him, which is why he does rank at the very bottom of this list. I think overlooking him would be a mistake, and shout out to some of you guys that were in the comment section last week. You know who you were, shouting out this player. Credit to you guys. I did mention that we can't guarantee that Damian Williams' workload was going to mirror that of David Montgomery. It was, of course, a risk factor in investing in Damian Williams, but if you were to tell me that Herbert was going to receive 18 touches on the ground in addition to Damien Harris getting a significant workload, I would have called you crazy. So for you guys out there that called it, props to you guys. But that's really going to do it for this week's running back list. Clearly, you guys can see why this week's running back list is quite possibly the most interesting we've had so far this season, but going to one of the most boring we've had of the season, we have our wide receiver position this week. Really, outside of the top player, there's nobody in here that we haven't discussed so far in another waiver wire video that we've already posted so far this season, so we'll gloss over the repeat players. The first one though, a player that's new to the list, is Kadarius Toney, rookie wide receiver for the New York Giants. So much is going on with the Giants team right now, I don't really know where to start. I guess we can begin with Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard, who were unavailable for this contest. Both players is dealing with a hamstring injury, neither of which was available in this last contest against the Dallas Cowboys. This left Kenny Golladay and Kadarius Toney, rookie first-round pick, to take up most of the work in the receiving game, presumably in this contest against the Dallas Cowboys, a very positive matchup. Kenny Golladay presumably leading this team from the receiver position, coming off of his most productive game as a New York Giant. Against New Orleans, he played on the most snaps he had seen throughout the entire season, saw the second most targets, but had his most productive day for both fantasy as well as receiving. So heading into his Week 5 matchup against Dallas, a team that's no stranger to putting up points offensively, Kenny Golladay was expected to build upon what he did in Week 4, but unfortunately he saw 3 targets before being taken out with a hyperextended knee, which is different than the injuries he had sustained so far throughout this season, which had him banged up and oftentimes seeing him on the sideline. This injury being unrelated, it was his loss, rookie Kadarius Toney's gain. Ultimately, Toney had an explosive performance. He received 13 targets, catching 10 of them for a whopping 189 receiving yards. Very Odell Beckham-esque, and even more impressive when you consider that Daniel Jones was knocked out due to a concussion at the early portion of this game. Jones himself only having 13 pass attempts, completing 5 of them for 98 yards before leaving the contest. This, of course, left Mike Glennon to lead this team from the quarterback position, and even under those less than ideal circumstances, Kadarius Toney shined. Outside of some heavy emotions, also Odell Beckham-esque, I think overall it was an extremely positive performance from him. Easily, it puts him atop the waiver wire list at the wide receiver position, with now the team's 3 top receivers outside of him, Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, and Kenny Golladay, now out with an injury and possibly even out next week. Kadarius Toney could yet again see another high target market share, much like he did in this past week. Before we do get too excited though, we do have to be aware that his next 2 matchups are against the LA Rams and Carolina Panthers, 2 teams that have been very difficult for opposing wide receivers. So even if you do take him off the waiver wire, I can't say for certain that we will have him listed as a start in the rankings this week. It'll obviously depend on league size, but it's a long season. We have 17 weeks this year, so taking him off the market and holding him on the bench, that can be a winning formula even if you don't reap the rewards of getting him off the waiver wire in the immediate week following. Behind him though, we do have another wide receiver, one that I will admit I have not been high on whatsoever so far this year. I've specifically avoided putting him on the waiver wire list in prior weeks, just due to me not believing in him as a long-term solution. It's Marquez Callaway of the New Orleans Saints. After his performance in Week 5, his production's just impossible to overlook. He saw the most targets he had seen on the season, coming in with 8. 8 targets as your season high does leave a bit to be desired, but what he did with those 8 targets was rather impressive. He caught 4 of them for 85 receiving yards, but also caught 2 receiving touchdowns in the process. That now makes 3 receiving touchdowns in his last 3 games, now making his 3rd straight contest where he's posted at least 70 receiving yards or a receiving touchdown in each contest. So over the past 3 weeks, he hasn't necessarily busted, and if his increased target market share in this offense is any indication of how they will begin to use him moving forward, his next 2 matchups against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Seattle Seahawks, those do leave a bunch of room for upside. The only issue, of course, is that he is going to be somewhat of a short-term rental because we are expecting Michael Thomas to return, and we can assume that with the type of volume that Michael Thomas has commanded throughout his career, as soon as he does return, there's a strong chance that there just won't be enough passing volume to go around to sustain Marquez Callaway's fantasy production. I know for some of you teams out there, a short-term rental may be exactly what you need. Maybe you do have an injured Kenny Golladay, maybe you're a Michael Thomas owner needing a stopgap temporarily, in which case Marquez Callaway could be exactly the type of player you need. But if you are going to get him off the waiver wire, just keep in mind that he does have a bye week in Week 6, which would be next week. But as mentioned, the next 3 matchups following that, Seattle, Atlanta, Tampa Bay, these are 3 premier matchups for the wide receiver position. So if his involvement does remain similar, I can't say I'd be all that surprised if Marquez Callaway posted a similar type of production in those matchups as well. The next wide receiver we don't have to spend all that much time on, it's Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals. This has been a player that we've spoken about in several of these waiver wire videos so far this season. What we know is that Rondale Moore is a key contributor on the best offense in the league, but it is a very deep wide receiver position. You have DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, Christian Kirk, and so far this season, both AJ Green and Christian Kirk, as well as obviously Hopkins, have been much more consistently involved in the passing game than that of Rondale Moore. In fact, Rondale Moore now had posted 2 consecutive bust games prior to many people dropping him to waivers, leaving him to have an ownership below 40%, only to follow that up with his Week 5 matchup against San Francisco, a game in which he led the team in receiving only behind DeAndre Hopkins, receiving more targets than both Christian Kirk as well as AJ Green, also proving to be the most efficient receiver out of those 3 as well. And while guessing exactly which receiver on this Arizona team behind DeAndre Hopkins is going to have the best fantasy day, it's not that easy. I know banking on the talent of both Christian Kirk and Rondale Moore is going to be the most beneficial for you in the long run. When it comes to rookie receivers, we're of course always expecting them to produce more consistently and produce higher end production as they get deeper into this season. So with this only being 5 weeks in, Rondale Moore is going to have some bust games along the way. So those 2 bust games he just had in back-to-back matchups in weeks 3 and 4. As a Rondale Moore owner, you should definitely exercise a bit more patience, potentially leaving him on the bench as opposed to dropping him. There's a very strong chance that the owners that did drop Rondale Moore, if he's currently on your waiver wire, they're unlikely to get him. And if Rondale Moore does take this opportunity to begin to play more consistently, you'll definitely regret dropping him for just 2 bad games. I understand roster spots are limited, but his upside as a talent as well as being on the offense that he's on, he's the perfect type of wide receiver that I do like to have on my bench, an upside guy that I'm not really questioning starting unless I'm sure I'm going to start him. So I'm going to sit on him until I can trust him in matchups or until the buys completely decimate my team. But looking at the next wide receiver, another one we don't have to mention all that much because we brought him up in other videos, the complete opposite of Rondale Moore, we have Tim Patrick. I believe I heard on Red Zone yesterday that Tim Patrick currently holds the highest active streak for receptions without a drop. If so, that matches up exactly with the type of outlook that I have for Tim Patrick, him being a reliable, consistent pass catcher. One that should be looked at is more of the high floor option as opposed to the high ceiling option of Cortland Sutton. But as long as Jerry Jeudy is out of the lineup, KJ Hamler, he's on IR, Tim Patrick is going to be a player that's in weekly flex consideration. Depending on the matchup, you could potentially do better with your flex spot, but many teams do have a need for the type of production Tim Patrick brings to your team, that being that Jarvis Landry-esque type production in a PPR league. Tim Patrick has posted double-digit fantasy points in all games but one, very consistently, ranging from 12.7 PPR fantasy points to 15.9, so very consistent week in and week out. And it surprised me to see that he's owned in less than 30% of leagues, so many of you out there in 12-team leagues should be able to grab him with ease. In 14-team leagues or deeper leagues, he's probably owned, but if you're able to get him off the waiver wire in that size of leagues, you definitely got yourself a gem. Moving into our final wide receiver, this is going to be Josh Gordon, who had his debut yesterday. Josh Gordon, now a member of the Kansas City Chiefs, he did finish the game with just 1 reception, but it was positive to see him step on the field. Just thinking of the potential upside of pairing Patrick Mahomes, one of the most talented quarterbacks when it comes to arm talent, with the potential upside of Josh Gordon and elder Josh Gordon at this point. But regardless, with many of the wide receivers, as mentioned, already players that we've talked about from one week or another, players that have performed and then underperformed, Josh Gordon is a fresh change of pace. We haven't yet seen what he can do with a full workload as a receiver for this team. A lot of people are discrediting the talent of Mecole Hardman, and for those people, you should be very thrilled that Josh Gordon's on the team. Mecole Hardman being the team's favorite for leading receiver behind Tyreek Hill. The only person now standing in his way is going to be Josh Gordon, so if you don't believe in Mecole Hardman, that is going to of course work in the benefit of Josh Gordon. But for me, at his age and the fact that he's so far removed from a successful fantasy season, at least a high-end one, it's hard for me to really rank him much higher than this. But with players on this list like Rondale Moore and Tim Patrick being players that you can immediately put in your lineup as early as week 6, Josh Gordon should appeal more to those teams that are a bit more set in their starting lineup, stronger teams that are just looking for a potential top 20 upside player that can either ride the bench and potentially pop off, or they can completely drop after a few weeks. I think that's exactly the type of team that should be looking into Josh Gordon, so if that suits your team build, then maybe you should raise Josh Gordon a bit in your personal waiver rankings. Moving over to the tight end position, we have Hunter Henry leading this list for the New England Patriots. It's unfortunate that the Jonnu Smith experiment really didn't work out, and really to the fault of his own, so I don't really feel all that bad, and his loss is Hunter Henry's gain. Hunter Henry now coming off of his 2 most productive games of the season, now in back-to-back weeks. We've seen the offense shift from targeting Jonnu Smith over to targeting Hunter Henry in very similar situations that we were previously obviously seeing go to Jonnu, and for that reason, I fully expect them to continue to expand upon his role because unlike Jonnu Smith, Hunter Henry is producing very well for the team, being a reliable outlet for Mac Jones, and with them building a very solid connection and foundation, I can certainly see them building upon it, especially in their next week's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, a team with a very strong offense and subpar defense. And at this point, with Hunter Henry now ranking inside the top 12, actually currently the tight end 8 in both standard and PPR, I wouldn't be surprised if after this game against Dallas and then his next game against the New York Jets, Hunter Henry doesn't push to even surpass that, potentially creeping into the top 5 at the position. The next tight end is probably one of the most surprising breakout candidates that we have this season. It is David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns. He's coming off of a 7 reception performance. Previously, his high on the season was 3 receptions in week 1. His high in receiving yards, 76 on the season. He nearly doubled that with 149 receiving yards, even catching his first touchdown of the season. Ultimately, his performance was just too good to ignore, so even though he has not been a consistent producer for this team, one thing that we do know about the Cleveland Browns is that they are lacking weapons at the receiver position. Rashard Higgins scored a touchdown, obviously a less than stellar wide receiver option, and with Jarvis Landry still on the IR, Odell Beckham being a bit more hit or miss at the wide receiver position for this team, I think David Njoku does have the ability to continue to be involved in this passing offense. When drafted, one thing that we knew about David Njoku was that he did have the chops to get it done in the receiving game, but one thing that would hold him back was just how strong of a blocker he is and how well of a tight end he was at all aspects of the position. For that reason, I don't think David Njoku should be a player that we just pick up off the waivers and immediately trust in our lineup. If you are to grab David Njoku off waivers, I think you should let him ride the bench, continue to monitor how this team uses him, and if we can begin to trust his usage in this offense, then at that point I would condone starting him, but I can't condone immediately thrusting him into your lineup off of a 1-game sample from a player who consistently has disappointed players who did trust him in the lineup. Regardless, he's extremely talented, he is an athletic monster, he has all the gifts potentially needed to be a superstar in the league. He really just hasn't been given an opportunity lately. I'd like to see what they can do with it, and I would hope that they can expand upon his role, but at this point it's just a speculative ad. The final tight end may come as a bit of a surprise. I don't think many people will include this player on their waiver list, but it's going to be Evan Engram of the New York Giants, and really there's no secret here. It all comes down to the plethora of injuries from this team. We have Kenny Golladay out, Darius Slayton out, Sterling Shepard out, Saquon Barkley out. Nearly every pass catcher for this team has now been injured. So if you think about it, this is starting to remind us of what this offense looked like last season. And although Evan Engram did not produce as a top tight end last season, when it came to the volume department, Evan Engram was one of the highest targeted tight ends in the entire league. If this team does move forward into other matchups looking as decimated at the receiver position, then I certainly believe that Evan Engram is going to see an increased role, much like he had last season. How valuable that role will ultimately be for fantasy remains to be determined, but with him being available in over 70% of leagues, this could be a player that you get off of waivers that is going to at least be targeted. So for those of you who maybe lost Logan Thomas and haven't found a solution since, maybe this is a player that's actually going to get some volume, because I know exactly how difficult that is to find at the tight end position in the free agent market. Moving over to quarterbacks, there really isn't any options that we haven't heard of. I'm going to start with Taylor Heinicke, a player actually coming off of a subpar matchup, in fact his worst of the season so far. In fact, his poor performance is exactly why I'm bringing him up, because it's very likely that after this week he is going to be dropped to waivers, meaning many leagues where Taylor Heinicke was stashed on a player's bench, he's likely going to now become available. So for those of you who are struggling at the quarterback position, Heinicke could quite possibly be a solution for you. Don't forget that prior to this matchup, he posted over 20 fantasy points in each of the past 3 contests, even posting a high of 27.9 fantasy points. That's actually good for top 5 production at the quarterback position. And with his next 2 matchups being against 2 offensive juggernauts, there's a very strong chance that Taylor Heinicke is going to have to pull out all stops in order to compete with them offensively. In those circumstances so far this season, that's when we've seen Heinicke actually play his best and perform the best for fantasy. So if he does end up dropping to waivers, I would certainly suggest that you consider him as a quarterback option. The second and final quarterback that we do do have is Sam Darnold, another player similar to Taylor Heinicke that I think could find his way to waivers this week. He's coming off of his worst performance of the season against the Philadelphia Eagles. Prior to this performance, though, Sam Darnold, we cannot forget, he's been performing as a mid-grade quarterback one. He had 5 rushing touchdowns through 4 games, had passed for over 300 passing yards in 3 of his 4 games as well, leading into week 5, throwing multiple touchdowns in 2 of those 4 contests as well. And for a player who's been a bit turnover prone, leading into week 5, he had only thrown an interception in 2 of his 4 contests as well. So overall, this has not only been the best football that we've seen played from Darnold, but this is some of the best football we've been seeing played in the entire league at the quarterback position so far this year. One bad performance from Philadelphia. We should not be throwing out or discrediting his accomplishments through the first 4 weeks. I think those are much more indicative of what we can expect moving forward, as opposed to this 1 game sample where he did underperform. For that reason, I think many teams that do have Darnold on the bench that drafted him as their backup quarterback, which many teams that did draft Sam Darnold, that is the purpose they drafted him for. And with him posting a fantasy day under double-digit points, we're talking 9 fantasy points, that may be enough motivation for a team that may have a consistent producer at the quarterback position, putting up 20 plus fantasy points in each week. That may be enough motive for them to drop Sam Darnold to the waivers, in which case I think you should definitely grab him if you're in need for a quarterback. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.